women, nature, and colonies were externalized, declared to be outside civilized society. The reason why we're here, right? So, the echoes of this colonization resound in green celebrity mommy businesses, which stress a return to natural practices from which it's assumed that Western cultures have been split. All right, and the split sounds suspiciously like white feminism as well, wherein Western women seek their freedom at the expense of non-white women and peoples. And it's also a split along class lines. There's a division there, given that these natural products offered by these businesses are decidedly far too expensive for working people's budgets. So, cost is not the sole factor in these discourses of nature, but also the question of caretakers' labor. The boom in celebrity motherhood enterprises was paralleled by another trend which highly influenced and intersected with them, and that's attachment parenting. There we go. So, in the late 2000s, attachment parenting rose to mainstream visibility primarily through celebrity endorsement. The aforementioned Dr. Mayim Bialik, her book was an attachment parenting memoir. And so it's polarizing, but it's still a dominant parenting philosophy, primarily practiced in upper middle class circles. And it springs from Dr. William Sears' The Baby Book, which was published in 1993, co-authored with his wife, Martha. So the three major tenets of attachment parenting are extended breastfeeding, which is breastfeeding past the age of 1, usually to 2 and beyond, co-sleeping, which is sharing your bed with infants and children, and baby wearing, which is wearing one's child in a sling or wrap that allows skin-to-skin contact with the child. So these major practices are not new innovations. In fact, he stresses that, they're traditional, but more importantly, that they're instinctive practices. Okay? So, for instance, he has this anecdote about Fijian co-sleeping practices. Quote, the mother of a patient of mine studied family sleeping habits on the island of Fiji as a research project for the World Health Organization. Fijian babies sleep next to their parents until weaning. The native women were surprised that the researcher even asked where babies sleep and said, quote, is it true American mothers put their babies in cages at night? So in this moment, you have Dr. Sears situating the Fiji practice of co-sleeping as a natural act, and then using Fijian women as a mouthpiece to express the idea that American practices are cruel and unusual. But I think also too, what is more important to me is that he's naturalizing these indigenous co-sleeping practices without examining perhaps how this practice may not necessarily be a choice for women, So he also does this with baby wearing, where he says that, these cultures that wear their babies cry less. And sure, having a crying baby can add to your burden, but it's also labor to carry your baby, they're heavy, so your sling can be comfortable, but you're carrying a child. And so he's playing into this idea of the happy, earthy, indigenous mother again. And this is idea of a return to a blissful natural state. This is not uncommon amongst proponents of attachment parenting. And yet it seems that this nurturing instinct is actually more intimately connected to human culture than proponents might think. For instance, Brooke Selza, studying breastfeeding practices of the Himba women in Namibia. So she went into there, it's an agricultural rural society where women breastfeed, bottle feeding is unknown, though women do supplement with goat's milk. So she went there, thinking they make breastfeeding look easy, what can we learn, and she too had this idea that we've lost the instinct to nurse in Western society. But as her work illuminated, Himba women's nursing success is actually due to having familial support. She said, it's not that we've lost the natural instinct for breastfeeding. Instead, we no longer have a grandma around 24/7 to be a teacher. So what she illustrates there is it's an error to assume that even these basic reproductive functions such as breastfeeding are innate or natural to human instinct. Indeed, what it seems to prove is that human culture is what is instinctual, and that culture and nature are not split, but one and the same. And it shows as well that women and caretakers need support to effectively parent children, for child rearing is labor. So, that's not a surprise for anybody who's done it. But I guess I would like to just close by saying, what really concerns me as well with this is the idea that what's been termed natural is becoming a class signifier. And that, Natural, not just meaning these products from goop, but also access to clean water, to whole foods, that these things are becoming class signifiers from which purportedly natural Western capitalist ventures profit from, that they're using the aesthetics of these people, but leaving them out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final presenter is Minjong King of Elmira College.
Slideshow at the top.
Okay, so I'm doing a little bit different thing from the other panelists. So I am doing a literary analysis. So what I'm trying to do in today's essay is to discuss Ian Foster's novel, A Room with a View, that was published in 1908. So this paper that I'm presenting is part of a larger project where I analyze British literature from the early 20th century. So the early 20th century was a very important and interesting time period in women's history. So we can all remember women's suffrage movement. And that's basically the first time in women's history where when women get out of home to get educated, to get a job, and to establish their presence in the public life. So against this historical background, a lot of texts were written to portray kind of strong, rebellious women characters, and they are all restless to get out of home and find new possibilities, right? So some of these women go all the way to like India, Hong Kong, like colonies, because they really want something new. And so I call these texts loosely the text of female Bildungsroman. So Bildungsroman draws upon the German tradition of the novel of development, where the protagonist basically grows up to as a functioning member of society. So one of my informing questions for the big project is to what extent these female Bildungsroman texts could be read as feminist texts, right? So Ian Foster's 1908 novel, A Room with a View, has inspired vibrant discussion for its multidimensionality. While each of these dimensions adds an interesting subplot, they are all subsumed to the novel's female protagonist Lucy Honeychurch's heterosexual marriage plot. Roughly summarized, A Room with a View describes the process in which Lucy, torn between two men, comes to choose one man over the other. The novel opens with Lucy's Italian trip, where she meets George Emerson, a depressed man with a lower class status. She's faintly attracted to him, but upon returning home, she gets engaged to Cecil Vyse, and this is Cecil on the left, who is a conventional self-conscious man of an upper class. Foster's novel presents these two men. George was in the main poster, that's George, and that's Cecil. Lucy, after experiencing some confusion between George and Cecil, ultimately decides to break off her engagement with Cecil and marries George, who embodies the Fosterian values of passion, spontaneity, the body, and the holiness of the desire. As the novel ends by celebrating Lucy's marriage with a jovial tone of what is well that ends well, A Room with a View has been understood as one of Foster's most conventional novels, or a cheerful Bildungsroman. Buried under its sunny facade, however, are deep, troubling questions about feminism's goals and strategies. In this essay, I investigate the status of the novel as a text of the female Bildungsroman, with a focus on the scope of Foster's feminist vision. I aim to highlight ways in which A Room, as a female Bildungsroman text, embodies feminist promises, but ultimately fails to deliver them. So the sea changes that took place in women's lives in early 20th century Britain, the increasing chances of education in education and employment, the demand of women's right to vote, the effort to establish women's presence in the public sphere, etc., opened up unprecedented possibilities to challenge male-dominant society and revise heteronormative gender configurations. In this historical context, many texts were produced portraying a female protagonist's aspiration for an alternative to the familiar domestic life determined by marriage and motherhood. These texts drew, albeit to a varying degree, on the tradition of the classical Bildungsroman, which aims to describe the protagonist's educational process to accept existing social orders. Unfortunately, many of these texts that portray the unconventional desires of rebellious women seem to fail to explore the oppositional potential that their initial attempts to describe women's development promise. In a room, multiple symptoms indicate its limit as a feminist text, but in this essay I focus on two aspects. One is the Italian background of the novel, and the other is the narrative disavowal of the spinster character. Over the course of the narrative, Lucy's effort to break free from social expectations of women is transformed into a search for a suitable marriage partner. This shrinking vision, caused by the shift of focus from structure to individual, is at one with an increasing acceptance of the patriarchal social order on the one hand, and is paralleled by an acceptance of other hierarchical social order, including British imperial superiority abroad and the devaluation of unmarried women at home. By studying this compromising process, I hope to emphasize the importance of feminism that aims at a systematic change of power structure for equity of all women and all humans. Responding different ways in which feminism responds to various demands of different times, feminist scholars have observed some unfortunate moments when feminism enters into a complicit relation with other forms of inequality and exploitation. The disturbing convergence of feminist ideas with the demand of larger hegemonic structures takes on different guises in different historical junctures, but one of the most salient examples is found in British liberal feminism of the early 20th century, which borrowed the language from and lent legitimation to colonial racial hierarchy. Calling such feminism imperial feminism, Antoinette Burton maintains that the British feminist identity as feminist depended upon convictions about the cultural, political, and racial superiority of all Britons. Burton's argument powerfully demonstrates the dangers of compromise and complicity to which feminism is subject. In Burton's words, middle-class British feminism produced a gender ideology that challenged in significant ways the basis on which women were excluded from power, but not all of the structures through which political power itself was constituted. Imperial feminism suggests, then, that imperialism became a framework out of which feminist ideologies operated. Out of all of Foster's works, it is his Passage to India, his most famous novel published in 1924, that received the most critical attention in light of imperial feminism. Meanwhile, Foster's two Italian novels, Where Angels Fear to Tread and A Room with a View, the novel that I'm discussing today, have mostly stayed outside the purview of critical scrutiny that examines the writer's interest in colonial matters. However, in A Room with a View, the Italian presence overdetermines Lucy's developmental process in its entirety. To discuss the ways in which the representation of Italy affects Lucy's search for an independent self, one might want to start by revisiting the novel's reputation as a sunny or successful female Bildungsroman text. Does the novel really describe Lucy's development? What kind of development do we observe? Does Italy help her to develop? If so, or what? If so, how? As I will discuss more in detail later, it may be more appropriate to call her change regression than development, because the novel is synonymous with Lucy's change from a free-spirited girl who dreams of something big to a conventional woman who finds satisfaction in domestic bliss. And as it will become clearer later, this regression has something to do with a specific view of Italy. If One reads Forster's novel as a narrative in which Italy exercises an insidious influence on the protagonist's regressive trajectory, as I do here. A contemporary text that bears most resemblance to a room may be Thomas Mann's novel Death in Venice in 1911. At the beginning, Mann presages that this is a story about German society currently in a crisis, searching for chances of rejuvenation through cross-cultural contact. Focusing on the interaction between the aging German artist and the young Polish boy, Mann might have been initially interested in drawing sharp boundaries within Europe at Germany's eastern borders, but to this east, European east, a wider, more free-floating, orientalizing cultural geography rushes in. As a result, recuperating Venice's historic role as a gateway to the Middle East, all these eastern wars eventually merge in the cholera epidemic. Originating in the hot swamps of the Ganges Delta in India, this cholera kills Ashenbach, the protagonist of the novel. So Ashenbach's failed rejuvenation in Venice is suggestive of the ways in which the Italian setting in a Rome takes a toll on Lucy's search for independence. Forster's novel does not irresolutely oscillate between the sunny Hellenistic Italy and the dark Italy stuck in the Middle Ages. One side is given more weight, as is the case in Death in Venice, and we need to pay careful attention to understand what is at stake to tip the scales. In Forster's text, a crucial link exists between the British colonial view of Italy and the woman protagonist of the novel. The presence of a young British woman traveler in a dangerous contact zone is used to accentuate the otherness of Italian culture and its destructive forces. In the opening pages of A Room, Lucy is introduced as a young woman who wants to escape the narrow conventional life at home. She says that she wants something there, and this is repeated throughout the novel. Surprisingly, however, our Lucy is berated, chided, and ridiculed throughout the entire narrative precisely because of her ardent desire to break free from the traditional domestic life. From the beginning, the narrator's attitude to Lucy is marked by a strong paternalistic impulse to tame the unruly girl. In the narrator's eye, Lucy is merely an immature girl who does not yet know who she is or what she wants. The narrator comments, she has no system of revolt. Here and there, a restriction annoyed her particularly, and she would transgress it, and perhaps would be sorry that she had done so. A Room with a View is fraught with tension between the woman protagonist who wants to escape the traditional definition of women's life on the one hand, and the narrator who dismisses such an attempt as an expression of immaturity on the other. This confrontational structure, which is created as one focuses on the structure and the other on the individual, dissolves as the narrator succeeds in taming Lucy. But this dissolution results in severe limitations on two levels. First, as the narrative emphasizes the individual characteristic of our female protagonist, meaning her rebelliousness, her emotional responses, it leads to the foregrounding of her individual life choices as well as the relegation of cultural political matters. Second, as she increasingly focuses on her individual matter, the central question of which concerns her marriage, of course, she is educated to accept the patriarchal order and simultaneously turn blind eyes to the colonial world order. These limitations are set in solid form as a love triangle emerges in part 2 of the novel. As a trait of Italy and Britain are projected into George and Cecil, the two men who compete with each other for Lucy, the love triangle that the three characters create throws a thick veil over the questions of cultural difference to render them totally invisible. Readers are shown something sinister, something enigmatic and unresolved about Italy, and they are invited to leave it at that. As the narrative shifts its focus from an exploration of colonial travel to the traveler herself, the cultural differences unevenly distributed along the axis of power are reified without being critically examined. The best thing an individual woman can do about it is to turn her eyes away from them. Lucy's developmental process in a dangerous contact zone shows in what ways a feminism that focuses on individual women in arbitrary isolation from their society falls short. As argued earlier, through Lucy's character, Foster reflects the feminist effort for gender equality and egalitarian social orders. However, as Foster's novel is propelled by a single focused pursuit of Lucy's individual reformation, it fails to problematize other important contextual issues that surround her development. By the end of the novel, she might have achieved the best thing available to her. A rebel who desired equality beside the man she loved does find a good husband in George, but best only in the sense that existing social orders are taken for granted and remain uncriticized. As the feminist vision of a room increasingly contrasts to exclusively focus on Lucy's individual life, the patriarchal order that defines domesticity as women's space and the global hierarchy that assumes British superiority and Italian inferiority are problematized briefly but ultimately left intact. In Foster's novel, therefore, the exotizing primitivist descriptions of Italy are not simply one unfortunate dark streak to Foster's otherwise laudable humanitarian and cosmopolitan worldview. This is basically the dominant interpretive tendency of Foster's novel. Rather, it is a necessary result within the Fosterian scheme of female development, which is concerned with grabbing the best chances available to individual women in an environment hostile to them. Anticipating the 21st century's neoliberal feminism that aims at the cracking of the glass ceiling for women in the corporate world, Lucy's development in A Room with a View demonstrates a working of a feminism that prioritizes individual women's success strategies within the status quo. So, I don't have time. So, in the next section, I try to